The radio crackle came at 3:47 hours, fragmented and desperate. Any station, this is Trident 6. We are, static swallowed the rest. Then nothing. Silence across every frequency monitored by CENTCOM forward operations. Somewhere in the Panjshir Valley, 8 Navy SEALs had gone dark during what should have been a textbook extraction. The last thermal imaging showed them pinned in a horseshoe canyon with insurgent forces closing from 3 directions. Fast movers were 30 minutes out. Apache gunships had already burned through their ordnance on another operation. The valley's terrain made drone strikes impossible without risking the team. Command needed someone who could fly low, slow, and angry. Someone expendable enough to send into a potential shoot-down scenario, but skilled enough to maybe pull it off. At Bagram Airfield, Captain Marin Kovac was elbow-deep in turbine maintenance when the alert came through. She didn't run to the briefing room. She walked, wiping grease from her hands with a rag that had seen better wars. The other pilots barely looked up. Kovac flew the A-10 Thunderbolt II, that ugly, beloved beast the Air Force kept trying to retire. While everyone else chased fifth-generation fighters in their glory, she'd chosen the Warthog, not because it was glamorous, because it worked. The briefing officer, a major who looked young enough to need parental permission for deployment, spoke quickly. "We've got a SEAL team compromised. Last known position here." He tapped coordinates on the digital map. Significant enemy presence, mountainous terrain, low visibility from smoke and dust. You'll be flying through a communications dead zone until you're directly overhead. Kovac studied the topography. The valley was a kill box, the kind of place where aircraft went to become statistics and cautionary tales in flight school. The major continued. "All other assets are committed or out of range. You're the only platform available that can loiter long enough to matter." Translation: "You're all we've got left." She nodded once. "Time to target. 37 minutes at max cruise." "I'll be there in 28. Someone snorted. The major's expression remained diplomatically blank. Kovac didn't care. She'd heard every variation of doubt before. Too slow, too old, too poor, too female, too immigrant, too single mom. The whispers followed her through every ready room, every promotion board, every mission brief. Let them whisper. The Warthog didn't care about her bank account or her accent or the fact that her daughter's daycare cost more than her car payment. It cared about physics and ammunition, and whether its pilot had the nerve to fly close enough to smell the battlefield. 16 minutes later, she was airborne, pushing the throttles forward as Bagram's lights fell away beneath her. The A-10 climbed with its characteristic determined ugliness, nose high, engines screaming their distinctive whine. She'd named this particular bird Marija, after her grandmother who'd survived 3 wars and never once asked for help. Tonight, the name felt prophetic. Kovac ran through her weapons check with the calm of someone who'd done this enough times to know panic was a luxury. 1,100 rounds of 30 ammunition for the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. 6 AGM-65 Mavericks on the outboard pylons. 4 500-pound bombs on the inboards. 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders for self-defense, though if she needed those, the mission had already gone catastrophically wrong. The AN/ALQ-184 electronic countermeasure pod hummed its quiet reassurance. She flew without lights, following the terrain by instruments and memory, keeping low enough that radar operators would lose her in ground clutter. The Hindu Kush mountains rose around her like the walls of some ancient fortress, dark against a darker sky. Stars wheeled overhead with that crystalline clarity that only existed at altitude in Afghanistan. She'd learned to navigate by them during her childhood in Bosnia, before the wars, when her father still believed the world made sense. That knowledge, dismissed as quaint by some of her fellow pilots, had saved her life twice. The radio remained silent on all tactical frequencies. Command wouldn't risk transmitting and giving away her approach vector. She was alone with her instruments, her weapons, and her thoughts. Those thoughts kept circling back to her daughter, asleep now in base housing, guarded by a neighbor who asked too few questions and charged too little. What Marin sent home each month kept them fed, clothed, educated. What she couldn't send was time. Every mission was a wager with those scales. The GPS coordinates scrolled closer. She began her descent, feeling Marija respond to every input with that honest, unforgiving feedback the A-10 was famous for. There was no fly-by-wire forgiveness here, no computer smoothing her mistakes. Just hydraulics, cables, and the oldest contract in aviation. You respect the aircraft, it brings you home. The Panjshir Valley opened before her like a surgical cut through the mountains, narrow and deep. Smoke rose from multiple points, visible even in the darkness as columns of deeper black against the charcoal sky. She activated her AN/AAQ-28 LITNING targeting pod, and the world below transformed into green-scale clarity. Heat signatures bloomed across her display, too many to count quickly. She swept the canyon systematically, looking for the pattern that would tell her where friendlies sheltered versus where hostiles maneuvered. There, a cluster of cooler signatures backed against a rock face, defensive positioning, conserving body heat, 8 figures. That had to be Trident 6. Surrounding them in a loose crescent, at least 40 heat signatures moving with the coordinated aggression of an organized assault. Some carried weapons large enough to show distinct thermal profiles. Heavy machine guns. Maybe a recoilless rifle. Definitely enough to turn 8 SEALs into a statistic. She keyed her radio, knowing the SEALs would be monitoring guard frequency even if they couldn't transmit. Trident 6, this is Hog 1, I'm overhead. Hold what you've got. No response. She hadn't expected one. Kavech banked hard, running calculations that were part math, part instinct, part prayer. The canyon walls rose 400 feet on either side, maybe 600 meters apart at the widest point. For most aircraft, that was impossibly tight. For the A-10, built to fly low and slow over European forests during a Soviet invasion that never came, it was workable. Barely. She rolled inverted to get a better angle on the enemy positions, and that's when the first tracers reached up toward her. Green lines of light, deceptively beautiful, marking the path of 12.7 rounds that could shred hydraulic lines and puncture fuel tanks. She rolled level, dropped chaff, kept flying. Someone down there had a DSHK, the Soviet heavy machine gun that had been killing aircraft since her grandparents' generation. Respect the classics. The targeting computer painted boxes around vehicle signatures. 3 technical trucks with heavy weapons mounted in their beds, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Standard Taliban tactics, learned from 30 years of fighting everyone who'd ever thought Afghanistan could be conquered. She selected the GAU-8, felt the familiar vibration as the Avenger spun up to firing speed. 30mm depleted uranium rounds, each one the size of a milk bottle, 70 of them per second. The gun that the aircraft was built around. Some pilots said flying the A-10 was like riding the world's most violent jackhammer. Kavech thought it felt like honesty. She nosed down, lined up on the northernmost technical and squeezed the trigger. The sound was beyond description, a metallic roar that vibrated through the airframe, through her seat, through her bones. A 2-second burst. 140 rounds. The technical disintegrated, literally came apart as depleted uranium met steel and won decisively. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition cooking off. She pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces press her into the seat, and immediately rolled into position for the second vehicle. Tracers followed her, always 3 seconds behind, the gunners tracking where she'd been rather than where she was going. She fired again. Another vehicle transformed from functional to scrap, but the third technical was moving now, driver smart enough to know staying still meant dying. She'd need a different approach. Kavech pulled up and away, climbing above effective small arms range, circling to reassess. Below, the enemy force was reacting, some breaking off their assault on the SEALs to deal with this new threat. Good. Dispersed enemies were easier to manage than concentrated ones. She selected a Maverick missile, let the infrared seeker find the moving vehicle, waited for the tone that meant lock. Fired. The missile dropped clear, motor ignited, and it streaked downward trailing white fire. The technical tried to swerve. Physics and explosive force disagreed with that plan. 3 heavy weapons down. But 40 rifles were still 40 rifles, and the SEALs were still pinned. Kavech needed to break the enemy's will, not just their equipment. She needed to make them feel what the SEALs felt, trapped, outgunned, desperate. She armed 2 of her 500-pound bombs and came around for another pass, lower this time, engines screaming as she descended into the canyon proper. The walls rose on either side, close enough that she could see individual rocks in her peripheral vision. Close enough that one wrong input would paint her across the mountainside. She pickled the bombs over the densest concentration of heat signatures, then pulled up so hard that the airframe groaned and the stall warning horn bleated its protest. The explosions lit the valley floor, twin blooms of orange fire that turned night briefly into day. The shockwave rocked her aircraft even at altitude. When her vision cleared, at least a dozen heat signatures had simply vanished. The others were scattering defensive positions abandoned in favor of survival. She keyed the radio again. Trident 6, Hog 1, you've got approximately 30 seconds before they remember they're supposed to be soldiers. Recommend you move now. This time there was a response, faint, crackling but human. Hog 1, Trident 6, can't. Terrain 2, the transmission died mid-sentence, but Kovac had heard enough. They couldn't move. Injured, maybe. Or pinned by terrain features she couldn't see from altitude, which meant she couldn't leave, couldn't strike and fade. Had to stay, had to keep the enemy suppressed, had to make herself a target so the SEALs wouldn't be. Every pilot's nightmare, every pilot's job description. She settled into a circular pattern above the valley, watching her fuel gauge with the attention it deserved. 43 minutes of loiter time at this altitude and throttle setting. After that, she'd have barely enough to make Bagram. No room for error, no allowance for additional combat maneuvering. The enemy forces were reorganizing faster than she'd hoped. Whoever commanded them knew their business. Small groups were bounding forward, using cover, maintaining fire discipline. She could suppress them, kill some, scatter others. But eventually they'd get close enough to the SEALs that she couldn't engage without risking friendly fire. The math was simple and terrible. She needed help. She switched to the command frequency. Any station, this is Hog 1 in the Panjshir. I have eyes on Trident 6, heavy enemy presence, request immediate backup. The response came from a controller she didn't recognize. Hog 1, nearest assets are Apache Flight Sabre 1-1, 23 minutes out. Fast movers are 40+, you're all they've got. Understood, we'll maintain. She didn't say what they both knew. 23 minutes was a lifetime. She went back to work. The GAU-8 spoke again, raking a ridge line where muzzle flashes betrayed enemy positions. She varied her pattern, never coming from the same direction twice, never at the same altitude. Predictability killed pilots, but unpredictability burned fuel. 28 minutes of loiter time remaining. The enemy tried a different tactic. Mortar fire, crude but effective. She watched the rounds arc upward on her thermal display, traced their trajectory back to the source. 2 Mavericks left. She used one. The mortar position ceased to exist in any meaningful way. A new voice crackled on the radio, stronger than before. Hog 1, this is Trident 6 actual. We have 2 casualties, 1 urgent, cannot move without assistance. Enemy is regrouping for another push. The voice was calm, professional. The voice of someone who'd accepted that this might be how the story ended but wasn't ready to stop writing yet. Roger, Trident 6, I'm not going anywhere, help is coming. Copy, Hog 1. Who are you? She smiled, though nobody could see it. Just somebody who showed up. 18 minutes of fuel remaining. The Apache flight was still 11 minutes out. She'd done the math 3 times, hoping the numbers would change. They hadn't. She could stay until the gunships arrived, but then she'd be gliding home on fumes and prayer, assuming she made it past the mountains. Or she could leave now, conserve fuel, let the professionals handle the rest. The professionals who weren't here, who couldn't be here in time. The enemy forces were moving again, emboldened by her reduced rate of fire. She'd been rationing ammunition, making every burst count. They'd noticed. Tactics adapted. They were learning that the warthog circling overhead had limits, testing those limits with probing movements, sacrificing 1 or 2 men to gauge her response. She couldn't let them think she was running dry. Kovac selected another Maverick, her last one, and dropped it on a group that had pushed too far forward too fast. The missile did its work. The probing stopped. 13 minutes of fuel. 8 minutes until the Apache. She ran the calculations again, factoring in glide ratios and emergency procedures, and which parts of the flight home she could manage without engines if it came to that. The numbers still didn't work. Her hand moved to the throttle, ready to advance it, to climb away from this valley and these men and this choice. Stopped. She thought about her daughter, about the promise she'd made to always come home, about the childcare bills and the cheap apartment and the carefully budgeted life they'd built from her paycheck and determination. Thought about what kind of person she'd be if she kept that promise by breaking this one. The 8 men below hadn't chosen cheap apartments. They'd chosen this. They'd volunteered, trained, deployed, but so had she. They had families who needed them home. So did she. No difference. No moral calculus that made one life worth more than another. She kept the throttle where it was, stayed in the pattern, watched her fuel gauge tick downward with the steady inevitability of a clock. The enemy tried again, 3 groups moving simultaneously, trying to divide her attention. She engaged the closest group with the GAU-8 2-second burst. The others dove for cover, not dead but delayed. She'd take it. 7 minutes of fuel, 3 minutes until the Apache. A lifetime. An instant, both. Hog 1, this is Sabre 1-1 flight of 2. We have you on radar 5 minutes out. The Apache pilot's voice was young, eager. She smiled despite everything. Sabre 1-1, Hog 1, targets are marked on your display. 8 friendlies at the rock face north side. Everyone else is hostile. Roger, we'll take it from here. You're cleared to RTB. Return to base. The words pilots live to hear. She should acknowledge, climb away, let the gunships finish this. She checked her fuel one more time. 4 minutes remaining. The Apache were 4 minutes out. Perfect synchronization. Except synchronization required her to stay exactly 4 more minutes, maintaining suppression, keeping the enemy pinned, flying on vapors. Sabre 1-1, Hog 1 will maintain until you're on station. A pause, then, Hog 1, your fuel state must be critical. We can handle this. I'm sure you can, but they're under pressure right now. If I leave, that changes. 4 minutes won't matter. It was a lie. 4 minutes might matter tremendously, might mean the difference between an uneventful landing and a very eventful crash. But 4 minutes definitely mattered to the 8 men below. The Apache pilot didn't argue. Understood, we're pushing it. She continued her pattern, watching the enemy, watching her fuel, watching the clock. 3 minutes. 2. The fuel warning light illuminated amber first, then red. Engine instruments still showed normal. For now. 1 minute. She could hear the Apache now, their distinctive wop-wop-wop echoing off the canyon walls before she saw them. Then they appeared, 2 angular shapes bristling with weapons, their infrared suppressors glowing faintly in her night vision. Beautiful. She'd never seen anything more beautiful. Sabre 1-1 has eyes on. We're engaged. The Apache split, 1 high, 1 low, their 30 chain guns already firing. Rockets streaked from their pylons. The enemy forces, caught between 3 aircraft and 8 angry SEALs, finally broke. Some tried to run, some tried to surrender, some kept fighting because that's what fighters did when there was nothing left but fighting. Kovach didn't stay to watch the end. She nosed up, climbed for altitude, and pointed Marija toward Bagram. The right engine coughed, ran smooth, coughed again. Fuel starvation. It was happening. She ran through the emergency procedures, voice calm as she spoke them aloud to herself, an old habit from training that had saved more than one pilot from panic-induced mistakes. Right engine flameout, shutting down right engine, single engine operation, adjusting trim. The left engine continued running, bless its titanium heart. 1 engine was enough, probably. The A-10 was designed to fly on 1 engine, could theoretically make it home on 1 engine. Theoretically. She calculated distance to Bagram, fuel remaining, glide ratio if the left engine quit. The numbers were close, prayer close. She reduced throttle to minimum sustainable thrust, trading speed for endurance. The aircraft slowed, mushed through the air with all the grace of a flying toolbox. She didn't care. Speed was ego. Altitude was life. She climbed slowly, painfully, gaining every foot she could before the fuel ran out completely. The Hindu Kush passed beneath her, ancient and indifferent. She thought about her grandmother Marija, who'd walked these mountains, European cousins during a different war, carrying 2 children and everything she owned, moving at night to avoid the soldiers who didn't care which side anyone was on. Bagram appeared on the horizon, a constellation of lights against the darkness. 15 miles, 10. The left engine coughed. She held her breath. It smoothed out. 5 miles. She could see the runway now, could imagine the approach, the landing, the debriefing where she'd have to explain why she'd stayed too long and risked too much. 2 miles. The engine ran rough, hiccuped, found fuel somewhere in the system. 1 mile. She contacted the tower. Bagram Tower, Hog 1, single engine emergency, straighten approach. Hog 1, Bagram Tower, you're cleared to land, runway 36. Emergency equipment is standing by. She didn't need it. Marija had taken her this far, they'd finished together. The runway rose to meet her, solid and real, wheels touched, smooth as a training flight. She let the aircraft roll out, shut down the remaining engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Alive. Home. Broke every fuel reserve regulation in the book, but home. The canopy opened. The ground crew chief, a master sergeant who'd been launching aircraft since before she learned English, looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Ma'am, you know you landed with 2 minutes of fuel, 2 minutes. I can count, Sergeant." "Yes, ma'am, I'm sure you can." He paused. "Hell of a thing you did tonight." She climbed down, legs shaky from adrenaline crash, and checked her watch. 6:12 hours. She had to pick up her daughter from the neighbor's house in 40 minutes. Shower change, pretend she'd been doing paperwork all night. The same lie she told every time. The same truth she couldn't tell. Walking toward the debriefing room, she passed a group of pilots from the fighter squadron. They stopped talking as she approached. She waited for the jokes, the barely concealed contempt. Instead, one of them nodded, just that. A nod. She nodded back. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. They asked about fuel management, risk assessment, decision-making under pressure. She answered honestly, waiting for the reprimand that never quite came. The major from the original briefing was there, along with a colonel she didn't recognize. Full bird, not someone who showed up for routine after-action reports. When the tactical questions ended, the colonel spoke for the first time. "Captain Kovac, do you understand that you violated multiple operational protocols tonight?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that you put your aircraft, yourself, and potentially the mission at risk?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that 8 SEALs are alive right now specifically because you violated those protocols?" She met his eyes, said nothing. The colonel smiled slightly. "Dismissed, Captain. Good work." She saluted, turned to leave. "Kovac." She stopped. The colonel's voice softened. "The SEAL team commander wants to meet you. They're at the hospital, thought you should know." She nodded, didn't trust herself to speak. At the hospital, she found Trident 6 in a room that smelled of antiseptic and blood. 8 men, various stages of injured, all alive. The one who'd called himself Trident 6 Actual sat up when she entered. Leg bandaged, arm in a sling, face showing the kind of exhaustion that came from dancing too close to death. "Captain Kovac." "That's me." "I'm Lieutenant Commander Hayes. I wanted." He stopped, started again. "We wanted to thank you, what you did up there, staying when you should have left, that was." "My job," she said quietly. "No," Hayes said. "Your job was to provide close air support. You did that. Then you did about 6 other things that weren't your job. You know what we call that? Stupid." One of the other SEALs, younger, with a bandage covering half his face, laughed. It broke the tension. Hayes smiled. "We call that family." "You stuck when you could have left, should have left, you stuck. That means something." She stayed for 10 minutes, accepted their thanks with the awkward grace of someone unused to acknowledgement. They asked about her aircraft, her training, her call sign. She told them the story, the short version, about her grandmother who'd survived everything and taught her that showing up mattered more than being invited. They understood that language. When she left, the sun was fully up, the Afghan heat already building. She drove to base housing, picked up her daughter from a neighbor who asked no questions, and made breakfast. Her daughter, 7 years old and already showing signs of her mother's stubborn independence, chattered about school and friends and things that mattered in the way that only mattered to 7-year-olds. Kovac listened, responded, present in the way she tried to be when she wasn't thinking about fuel states and firing solutions. "Mama, you look tired." "Long night, baby. Paperwork." Her daughter studied her with those 2 knowing eyes. Important paperwork. Very important. That at least was true. She slept 3 hours, woke to her alarm, returned to the flight line. There was maintenance to oversee, mission planning to review, the ordinary rhythm of military aviation. Nobody mentioned the previous night's mission. That wasn't how it worked. You flew, you came back, you did it again. No parade, no speeches, just the work. But in the afternoon, she found something new stenciled on Marriage's nose below the canopy. Unofficial, definitely against regulations, but there in fresh paint, a small trident symbol, the SEAL insignia. No words, no explanation needed. The crew chief appeared beside her. "They came by this morning, ma'am, asked if they could, I figured." "It's fine, Sergeant." "Yes, ma'am," he paused. "For what it's worth, the whole flight line's talking about what you did. I didn't do anything special." "With respect, ma'am, that's crap." She looked at him, surprised. He shrugged. "You flew into hell, stayed past empty, brought everyone home. That's the definition of special. And if you don't mind me saying, maybe it's time you started believing that." The weeks that followed were ordinary in the way military life was ordinary. Missions, maintenance, meetings. She flew CAP, convoy escort, reconnaissance. Normal rotations. But something had shifted, subtle as wind direction. The jokes in the ready room lost their edge. When she entered briefings, conversations continued instead of stopping. Younger pilots started asking her questions, actual questions about tactics and terrain, treating her like someone whose answers mattered. She didn't know how to process it. Validation shouldn't arrive through violence. Respect shouldn't require almost dying. But she'd spent enough years in uniform to know the military had its own moral geometry, angles that didn't exist in civilian life. You proved yourself not through credentials but through action. Not through what you said but through what you did when everything was on fire and the radios were screaming. 3 weeks after the Panjshir Valley, she got orders. Report to Kandahar for a temporary duty assignment. Training mission, 3 weeks, teaching close air support tactics to a fresh squadron straight from the States. She almost laughed, them asking her to teach. Her who'd been washing out turbines while others flew glory missions. Her whose existence some commanders barely acknowledged. The universe had a sense of humor. At Kandahar, she met the squadron. 20 pilots, average age 26, average combat missions 0. They looked at her A-10 with the expression of people who'd shown up to a car show and found a tractor. She gathered them in a briefing room, stood before the PowerPoint she hadn't prepared, and spoke instead from memory. "My name is Captain Kovac. I fly the A-10. You've been flying F-16s. You think you're faster, smarter, more advanced. You're right, but speed means you're gone before you see what matters. I'm going to teach you how to stay, how to see, how to be there when everyone else has left." She taught them the way her grandmother had taught her, through stories that were really principles, through details that revealed philosophies. She explained loiter time, fuel management, ammunition conservation, the unglamorous calculus of persistence. She showed them gun camera footage from missions she'd flown, narrating not just what happened but what she'd been thinking, the decision trees that branched in real time. When to engage, when to wait, when the rules mattered and when survival mattered more. One pilot, a lieutenant named Jackson, with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly tested, raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, the A-10 is being phased out. Why are we learning tactics for an aircraft that won't exist in 10 years? She nodded slowly. "You're right. The A-10 probably will be retired. They've been trying to kill it for 30 years. But the mission won't be retired. The requirement, someone needs to fly low, stay long, and give a damn about the people on the ground, that's permanent. These tactics work in anything with wings. What I'm teaching you isn't about the aircraft, it's about the commitment." Jackson looked skeptical. She didn't blame him. "Let me tell you about a night in the Panjshir Valley," she said, and she told them not everything, not the fuel gauge or the fear or the moment she almost left, but enough. About the choice, about staying. About 8 men who went home to families because someone showed up and wouldn't leave. When she finished, the room was silent. Then a pilot in the back, a captain older than the others, spoke. "That was you, the hog pilot who saved the SEAL team." "I didn't save anyone, I provided air support." "Ma'am, that's not what we heard. We heard you flew on fumes, heard you stayed past bingo fuel." "Bingo fuel is a guideline, flameout is a fact. I managed the space between them." The captain smiled. "Yeah. That's what we heard." The 3 weeks at Kandahar became 5. The squadron commander requested an extension, then another. Kovach taught because teaching was orders, but also because these pilots, for all their youth and certainty, were listening. Actually listening. They flew training sorties, mock CAS missions where she played both instructor and adversary. She showed them how to read terrain, identify threats, coordinate with ground forces who might not speak perfect English or know proper radio protocol. Taught them that the mission wasn't about proving yourself. It was about doing the job when the job was impossible. One evening, Jackson approached her outside the hangar. The confidence had worn down to something more useful, humility tempered by understanding. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. What I said about the A-10, about the tactics being obsolete, that was accurate," she said. "The A-10 is old, it is being phased out. You weren't wrong. But I was missing the point." "Yes, the point being." She looked up at the sky where stars were just beginning to appear. "The point being that technology changes. Tactics change, but the commitment to the mission, to the people depending on you, to staying when you could leave, that doesn't change. That's what saves lives, not airframes, not weapon systems, people who give a damn." Jackson nodded. "For what it's worth, ma'am, you've changed how I think about flying." "Don't think about flying," she said. "Think about who you're flying for." She returned to Bagram at the end of the assignment, found her squadron different, or maybe found herself different. The XO offered her a desk job, operations officer position, more responsibility, more visibility, better for promotion. She turned it down. "I appreciate it, sir, but I'd rather keep flying." "Captain, you're good at this, command material, but flying the hog doesn't advance careers, you know that." "Yes, sir, I do." He studied her. "You really going to stay with the A-10 until they forcibly remove you from the cockpit?" "That's the plan, sir." Her daughter started third grade. Kovach made it to parent-teacher conferences, school plays, soccer games. Not all of them, not even most, but more than before. The other mothers were polite, distant. She didn't fit their patterns, single, military, foreign accent, no time for playdates or fundraising committees. Her daughter didn't seem to mind. She'd inherited her mother's comfort with solitude, her grandmother's ability to find strength in the spaces between belonging. On a Saturday, rare day off, they drove into Kabul. Dangerous, technically against regulations, but Kovach wanted her daughter to see Afghanistan as more than a military base. They walked through markets, ate street food, watched children playing soccer in dusty lots. Her daughter asked questions in the way children did, direct and unfiltered. "Mama, why do you fly planes?" "Because I'm good at it." "Are you scared?" Kovach considered lying, decided on truth. "Sometimes. But doing the right thing usually involves being scared. What if something happens to you? Then you remember everything Grandma Marija taught us. You survive, you stay strong, you take care of yourself." Her daughter was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you save people in your plane?" "I helped them. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Helping is what you can control. Saving is what you hope happens after." They drove back to base before sunset, before the city turned dangerous. Her daughter fell asleep in the passenger seat, head against the window. Kovach drove carefully, watching the road and the horizon with equal attention, thinking about legacy and what she was leaving behind. Not wealth, not stability, but maybe something more valuable, the example of showing up, of doing the hard thing, of staying when staying cost everything. Winter came to Afghanistan, such as it was. Temperatures dropped, snow fell in the mountains. The war continued with its usual rhythm. Attacks, responses, negotiations that went nowhere, promises that meant nothing. Kovach flew missions, trained pilots, maintained her aircraft. Marija was showing where now, 18 years old, overdue for retirement or deep maintenance. Small cracks in the fuselage, hydraulic systems that required constant attention, avionics from an earlier generation. But she flew. That was all that mattered. In December, she got called to the squadron commander's office. He was new, a lieutenant colonel who'd arrived with ideas about efficiency and optimization. "Captain Kovach, I've been reviewing your record." "Yes, sir." "You've been flying the A-10 for 8 years. You've deployed 4 times. You've logged more combat hours than anyone in the squadron." "Yes, sir." "You've also turned down 3 different opportunities to transition to other aircraft. 2 chances at promotion. 1 instructor position at Nellie's." "Why?" She chose her words carefully. "Sir, I believe in the mission. The A-10 does things no other platform can do. The A-10 is 40 years old, it's expensive to maintain. Congress wants it gone, the Air Force wants it gone. But the soldiers on the ground don't want it gone. He leaned back. No, they don't, which creates a problem. Sir, the problem is that people like you, who actually know how to employ the aircraft effectively, are rare. We can't retire the damn thing because every time we try, someone like you does something impossible and proves we still need it, he sighed. You're making my job difficult, Captain. Not my intention, sir. I'm sure, he pulled out a folder. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for that thing in the Panshir. It took a while to push through, you know how awards work, but it's happening. Ceremony next month. She blinked. Sir, that's not necessary. It's not about necessary. It's about deserved. The ceremony was small, held on the flight line because tradition said you honored pilots where they worked. The squadron gathered, along with some people she didn't recognize, officers from other units, someone from JSOC, a news crew that the Public Affairs Office had invited over her objections. The citation was read aloud, formal language that turned hours of terror into neat paragraphs of heroism. She stood at attention, uncomfortable in her dress uniform while the medal was pinned to her chest. People applauded. She tried not to wince. After the ceremony, someone from the news crew approached, young woman eager, holding a microphone like a weapon. Captain Kovac, can I ask you a few questions? No, it'll just take a minute. Our viewers would love to hear about your experience as a female combat pilot. Then they can read the official report. The reporter persisted. What would you say to young women who want to follow in your footsteps? Kovac paused, thought about all the dismissals, the assumptions, the endless low hum of doubt she'd flown through like turbulence. Thought about her daughter who'd asked why she flew planes. I'd say that competence is the only credential that matters. Everything else is noise. Learn your job, do your job, show up when it matters. The rest takes care of itself. That's great. And do you feel like you've broken barriers for women in aviation? I feel like I've flown missions. Other people can decide what that means. She walked away before the reporter could ask more questions, found her crew chief near Marija running his daily inspection. Congratulations, ma'am. About time they recognized what you did. It's just a medal, Sergeant. No, ma'am, it's proof. Of what? He gestured at the aircraft, the stenciled trident still visible below the canopy. That showing up matters, that the old, ugly stuff still works when everything else fails. That sometimes the people nobody pays attention to are the ones who save the day. She looked at Marija, scarred and patched and absolutely reliable. You're talking about the plane, right? I'm talking about both of you, ma'am. 3 months later, she rotated home. Back to the States, back to a base where the pace was slower and the stakes somehow felt higher. Her daughter enrolled in a new school, made new friends. Kovac transitioned to a training squadron, teaching the next generation of A-10 pilots the craft she'd spent years perfecting. It should have felt like a demotion. It felt like purpose. The students were different here, younger, less certain, unforged by deployment. She taught them the basics first. Systems, procedures, emergency protocols. Then she taught them the harder lessons, how to make decisions when every option was bad, how to manage fear without eliminating it, how to trust your instruments and your instincts in equal measure. Some of them asked about the Panshir Valley. Word had spread despite her efforts to avoid publicity. The story had grown in the telling, acquired embellishments she didn't recognize. She corrected the myths, stuck to facts. The mission was simple. People needed help. I had the aircraft and ordnance to help them. I stayed until they didn't need help anymore. That's the whole story. But you almost ran out of fuel. Almost is a relative term. Weren't you scared? She considered the question. Fear is information. It tells you that consequences exist. What you do with that information determines whether you're a pilot or a passenger. One student, a young woman who reminded Kovac of herself 10 years earlier, asked a different question. Ma'am, do you ever feel like you have to prove yourself more because you're a woman? No, Kovac said. I feel like I have to prove myself because I'm a pilot. Gender is irrelevant. Competence is everything. But you face discrimination, right? Bias. Of course, everyone faces something. Height, weight, accent, background, whatever. The question isn't whether obstacles exist. It's whether you let them define your ceiling or your starting line. The student nodded. not entirely satisfied, but understanding the answer wouldn't be simple. Nothing about this profession was simple. Years passed. Kavech made major, then lieutenant colonel. They kept trying to move her away from flying, kept offering staff positions and command opportunities. She kept declining, kept requesting cockpit assignments. The A-10 fleet shrank, kept alive by congressional intervention, and the simple fact that nothing else could do its job quite as well. She flew less, taught more, found unexpected satisfaction in shaping new pilots. Her daughter grew, became a teenager with opinions and ambitions that sometimes aligned with her mother's values and sometimes crashed spectacularly against them. They fought about curfew, friends, the fact that Kavech's job meant missing events that mattered. Normal parent-child warfare, except conducted across time zones and deployment schedules. "You care more about your job than me," her daughter said during one particularly heated argument. Kavech, tired from a transcontinental flight and a training mission that had gone wrong, snapped back. "I do this job so you can have choices I didn't have. I'd rather have a mother who's here." The words hit harder than expected. Kavech sat down, suddenly exhausted. "You're right, you're absolutely right. I miss too much. I'm gone too often. I'm sorry." Her daughter, surprised by the admission, softened. "Why do you do it, really?" "Because I'm good at it, because people depend on it, because—" She struggled for words. "Because my grandmother survived 3 wars so I could have a chance. I fly missions so you never have to. That's the deal." "That's a stupid deal, probably, but it's ours." They reconciled the way families did, imperfectly and with lingering damage, but reconciled. Her daughter eventually chose college, picked a major that had nothing to do with military service. Kavech tried not to feel relieved. Tried not to notice that her daughter had chosen a path with more stability, more presence, more possibility of showing up for the people who mattered. Maybe that was the real legacy. Not following footsteps but learning from them. Not repeating patterns but understanding their cost. Kavech made colonel at 43, older than average, having taken the long road through every rank. They offered her a wing command, the kind of position that meant you'd truly arrived. She accepted, surprising herself. The job came with politics, paperwork, responsibilities that had nothing to do with flying. But it also came with the chance to shape culture, to decide how the next generation of pilots would be trained and what would be valued. She used that leverage carefully. Pushed for more realistic training, less focus on technology and more on fundamentals. Created mentorship programs that paired experienced pilots with new ones, regardless of aircraft type. Wrote doctrine that emphasized mission over ego, persistence over flash. Some senior officers approved. Others thought she was fighting yesterday's wars, clinging to obsolete platforms and outdated thinking. She didn't argue, just kept working, just kept showing up. The A-10 finally began its actual retirement, a slow drawdown that everyone knew was inevitable. The aircraft that had served for 4 decades was genuinely obsolete now, outmatched by modern air defenses, unable to survive in contested environments. The mission it had performed so well would be distributed among drones, F-35s, Apache helicopters. Progress, they called it. Kavech attended the retirement ceremony for her old squadron, watched as the last A-10s in the unit were flown to the boneyard. Marija was already there, parked in the Arizona desert with hundreds of her sisters, waiting for either resurrection or recycling. She'd flown that aircraft to its last landing herself, 2 years earlier. Perfect approach, perfect touchdown, then shut down the engines for the final time. Hadn't cried, had wanted to. At the ceremony, generals spoke about the A-10's legacy, its combat record, its place in aviation history. They showed footage of strafing runs, missile strikes, successful rescues. Someone mentioned the Panjshir Valley mission, though not by name. Just one of many instances where A-10 pilots exceeded all expectations and brought American service members home safely. She stood in the back, wearing her dress uniform with its accumulation of ribbons and badges, and thought about all the missions that didn't make the highlight reel. The boring patrols, the maintenance delays, the hours of flying that involved nothing more dramatic than staying airborne. That was the real story. Not the one dramatic night, but the thousand unremarkable ones. The commitment to showing up, even when showing up meant nothing happened. After the ceremony, several younger officers approached her. They'd heard stories, wanted to meet the famous A-10 pilot. She signed autographs, posed for photos, felt absurd doing both. One lieutenant, fresh from training, asked the question they all eventually asked. "Ma'am, what was it like, flying the hog in combat?" She thought about all the possible answers. The fear, the adrenaline, the weight of knowing that mistakes cost lives. The beauty of dawn over Afghan mountains, the terror of tracers reaching up through darkness. The boredom, the discomfort, the constant calculation of fuel and ammunition and risk. Thought about 8 Navy SEALs in a valley and a night when she stayed past empty. "It was the job," she said finally, "just the job." "But you're a legend, ma'am. That mission in the Panjshir was one mission, on one night. The real work was everything else. The training, the maintenance, the discipline. The 1,000 flights where nothing happened because we did it right, that's what mattered." The lieutenant looked disappointed, wanting drama and getting doctrine. But another officer, older, a major with her own collection of combat ribbons, nodded understanding. "She's right," the major said. "The legend is what people remember. The legacy is what we learned." Kavach met the major's eyes, saw recognition there. Another pilot who'd fought for respect, earned it through competence, understood that the work mattered more than the glory. She smiled, nodded. The major nodded back. No words needed. Later, driving home through the desert night, Kavach thought about legacy. Not the medal in her drawer or the stories people told. The real legacy. She thought about the pilots she'd trained, hundreds of them now, scattered across the Air Force. Some would never see combat. Some would face situations where training mattered more than talent. All of them would carry forward what she'd taught, not just tactics, but philosophy. Show up, stay long, give a damn. She thought about her daughter, graduated now, working in Seattle, building a life that had nothing to do with aircraft or warfare. They talked weekly, easy conversations about ordinary things. Sometimes her daughter asked about the military, about the choices Kavach had made, understanding growing where judgment had been. "Mom, do you regret it? All the time you spent away?" "I regret missing your childhood. I don't regret the work." That's a pretty fine distinction. It's the only one that matters. Kavach retired at 50 after 28 years of service. The ceremony was larger than she wanted, smaller than some suggested. Her daughter attended, proud in a way that teenage bitterness had prevented years ago. They presented her with a plaque, a flag, a shadow box containing her medals and rank insignia. Someone had added the small trident symbol, unofficial but acknowledged. She gave a short speech, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding it was expected. Talked about service, commitment, the privilege of flying in defense of people who'd never know her name, kept it brief. At the reception, a man approached, older, civilian clothes but carrying himself with military bearing. "Colonel Kavach, I'm Daniel Hayes. We met once about 15 years ago in a hospital in Bagram." She studied him, memory assembling pieces. The bandages, the exhaustion, the voice on the radio. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Trident 6. Just Dan now. Retired 5 years ago," he smiled. "I heard you were retiring, thought I should pay respects." "That's a long trip for respects." "Not really. I live 2 hours from here. Moved after I got out, wanted to be near mountains." He paused. "I wanted to tell you something. That night in the Panjshir, when you stayed past your fuel reserves, you saved 8 lives. But it was more than that. You changed how we thought about support, about commitment. I built my career on the lesson you taught, that showing up matters more than being the best. I taught it to every SEAL I trained. They're teaching it to their people. That's your legacy. Not one mission, the ripple from it." She didn't know what to say. Hayes continued. "You probably don't remember, but you said something in that hospital. I asked what to call what you did, staying when you should have left. You said it was just your job. That stuck with me. The idea that excellence should be ordinary, not exceptional. That doing the right thing is just the job. It is the job. I know. And because of pilots like you, people like me got to do our jobs and come home. My daughters got their father back. My wife got her husband back. That's not nothing." She met his eyes. "It was never nothing. That's why I stayed." In retirement, Kavach found herself unmoored in the way many veterans did. The structure was gone, the mission, the daily certainty of purpose. She'd spent 3 decades knowing exactly what she was supposed to do. Now freedom felt like falling. She consulted for defense contractors, taught part-time at a civilian flight school, wrote articles for aviation journals. Stayed busy, stayed relevant, stayed in some fundamental way, still flying missions even without an aircraft. Her daughter visited frequently, bringing grandchildren, 2 boys who treated their grandmother with the amused affection reserved for elderly relatives who'd done interesting things in the past. Kavach taught them to read maps, to navigate by stars, to understand that technology failed and fundamentals saved lives. Skills they'd probably never need. Skills that mattered anyway. Sometimes, driving past the local Air Force base, she'd watch aircraft taking off and landing. Modern fighters training planes transport aircraft. No A-10s. Those were gone now, fully retired, preserved in museums or scrapped for parts. The mission continued with different platforms, different tactics. The same commitment. She wondered if the new pilots understood what they'd inherited. The tradition of showing up, of staying past empty, of giving more than was required because the mission demanded it. Wondered if anyone taught them about the pilots who'd come before, who'd proven that old and ugly and underestimated could still save lives. Probably not. That wasn't how the military worked. You did your time, did your job, passed the torch and moved on. The work continued regardless of who held it, as it should be. One afternoon her daughter called with news. "Mom, I'm pregnant again, due in April. Congratulations, how are you feeling?" Tired, excited, scared. A pause. "We're thinking about names. If it's a girl, we'd like to name her Marija, after great-grandma, and you..." Kavach felt something shift in her chest. "You don't have to do that." "I want to. You taught me that names carry weight, that legacy matters. I want my daughter to carry that weight. It's a heavy name. She'll have strong shoulders. It runs in the family." The years settled into a rhythm. Grandchildren grew, learned, asked questions about the old days when grandma flew warplanes. She showed them photos, told sanitized stories, avoided the parts that involved blood and fear and choices that still occasionally woke her at night. They didn't need those details. They needed to know that service mattered, that commitment meant something, that when the world required you to show up, you showed up. Her granddaughter Marija, named for 2 survivors, showed early signs of that same stubborn determination. Asked too many questions, accepted too few easy answers. Kavach watched her grow and saw familiar patterns, the refusal to be dismissed, the insistence on being taken seriously. Whether that would lead to military service or some entirely different path, time would tell. At 70, Kavach received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy. A symposium on close air support, historical perspectives, lessons from recent conflicts. She almost declined. But the invitation was signed by a colonel she recognized, one of her former students now teaching at the academy. He'd added a personal note. "Your students need to hear your story, not the legend, the truth." She went. Spoke to a classroom full of cadets who looked impossibly young. Talked about tactics, fuel management, risk assessment. Then talked about the harder topics. About being underestimated and using that as armor. About the cost of commitment and why it was worth paying. About showing up not because you were the best but because you were there. During the Q&A, a female cadet raised her hand. "Ma'am, what would you say to someone who feels like they constantly have to prove themselves?" Kavach smiled, recognizing the question because she'd lived it. "Stop trying to prove yourself to others. Prove yourself to yourself. Meet your own standards. Everything else is noise." But what if the noise is constant? What if it never stops? Then you learn to fly through it. The noise doesn't disappear. You just get better at ignoring it while staying focused on what matters. The cadet nodded, not entirely satisfied but understanding there was no simple answer. There never was. After the symposium, the colonel who'd invited her took her to lunch at the Academy's Officers Club. "Thank you for coming, ma'am." The cadets needed to hear that. They needed to hear it from someone still serving. "I'm just history now." "No, you're proof that the work matters, that the unglamorous missions, the old platforms, the pilots nobody noticed, that they're essential." He paused. "I've been teaching here 5 years. Every semester I tell the story about the Panjshir Valley. Not with names, just the facts. SEAL team pinned down A-10 pilot who stayed past bingo fuel. Everyone came home. Then I ask what they learned. The answers vary. But the best students always say the same thing, that excellence is about commitment, not credentials. Kavach shook her head. That wasn't excellence. That was desperation with good timing. Call it what you want, it mattered. And the lesson from it matters more. They talked about the current state of air power, the missions being flown, the platforms in development. Kavach listened more than she spoke, understanding that her era had passed. The future belonged to drones, artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, technology she barely understood, but the fundamentals remained constant. Physics didn't change. Gravity didn't negotiate. Fear still needed to be managed, and courage still needed to be cultivated. The platform changed. The pilot's heart didn't. Driving away from the academy, mountains rising to the west, she thought about her grandmother Marija. Dead 20 years now, but present in every decision Kavach made, every lesson she taught. Her grandmother had survived 3 wars without ever firing a shot, had protected 2 children through landscapes that killed millions. That was courage. Flying combat missions with a multi-million-dollar aircraft and extensive training, that was just logistics. But maybe logistics was how you honored legacy. By taking the opportunities previous generations had fought to create and using them to protect the next generation. By showing up. By staying. By giving a damn even when it cost everything. At 75, Kavach's health began to fail. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of years and stress and missions that had asked more than bodies were designed to give. Her daughter insisted she move closer, into an apartment near their house where help was available. She resisted, then relented, understanding that stubbornness had limits. Her granddaughter Marija, now in college, visited frequently. She'd chosen to study engineering with a particular interest in aerospace. Not flying, but designing. Creating the next generation of aircraft that would carry the next generation of pilots into whatever conflicts the future held. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" They were sitting on the apartment's small balcony, watching sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded Kavach of Afghanistan. "Of course. Do you think it was worth it? Your career, all the time away from Mom, all the sacrifices?" Kavach considered the question carefully. "That depends on what it means. Was it worth missing your mother's childhood to fly combat missions? No, nothing's worth that. Was it worth protecting people who needed protecting? Yes, every time. That seems contradictory. It is. Most important choices are." Her granddaughter was quiet for a moment. "I want to do something that matters, like you did." "Then do something that matters to you. Don't try to replicate my path. Find your own." "But your path was incredible." Kavach laughed, a sound that turned into a cough. "My path was one choice after another, most made without enough information or time to think. It looks like a story now because stories have structure. Living it was just momentum and stubbornness. And showing up. And showing up. Yes." They sat in comfortable silence, 3 generations of survival compressed into this moment. Kavach thought about her grandmother, who'd never lived to see her granddaughter become a pilot. About her daughter, who'd built a life defined by presence rather than absence. About this girl carrying their name forward, choosing her own version of service. Legacy wasn't repetition. It was transformation, taking what previous generations had learned and building something new from it. Kavach died at 78 peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was well attended, family, former students, pilots she'd served with, some faces she recognized and many she didn't. Someone had arranged a flyover, 4 A-10s from one of the few remaining squadrons performing the missing man formation. She would have hated the attention, would have approved of the choice of aircraft. They buried her with full military honors. The flag was folded, presented to her daughter, who accepted it with the composure of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning not to cry in public. Her granddaughter spoke at the service, words carefully prepared but emotionally delivered. "My grandmother taught me that showing up was more important than being invited, that competence mattered more than credentials, that the work you did when nobody was watching defined you more than the work everyone applauded." She showed up. For missions, for students, for 8 strangers in a valley who needed someone to stay past empty. And in staying, she taught all of us what commitment looks like. Not easy, not painless, but essential. The words echoed in the chapel, settled into silence. Somewhere in the Arizona desert, marriage of the aircraft sat among hundreds of retired planes, waiting for resurrection, recycling, or simply the slow dissolution of time. The trident symbol, faded now, still visible below the canopy. A marker that someone had once done something worth remembering. The mission continued. Different platforms, different tactics, same commitment. New pilots flying into new conflicts, carrying forward lessons they might not know they'd inherited. That was the real legacy, not the medal or the stories or the speech at her funeral. The continuation. The unbroken line of people who showed up, stayed long, and gave a damn about the people depending on them. The work continued. The work always continued. And somewhere, in ready rooms and briefing rooms and cockpits around the world, pilots prepared for missions that would test them in ways they couldn't predict. Some would fail. Some would succeed. All would carry forward the accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd flown before them, including one immigrant single mother who'd flown an obsolete aircraft into hell and stayed past empty because 8 strangers needed someone to care whether they lived or died. That was the story. Not a story about aircraft or awards, a story about choice, about staying when you could leave, about showing up when it mattered most, the kind of story that didn't end with funerals or retirements, the kind that continued, passed forward through training and example, and the simple question every pilot eventually faced: when it matters most, when the mission is impossible and the cost is everything, what will you do? Kavech had answered that question in a valley 15 years ago. Her answer echoed still. Show up, stay long, give a damn. The rest was just details.